It's time for the Phil Ferguson Show.
This is Phil Ferguson, and you are listening to The Phil Ferguson Show. This is show number 262. We're somewhere in the middle of late May, I guess. Late May, we'll go with that. And we have an interview coming up with Jonah Connor, and he wrote a book all about the Bible and the absurdities and the contradictions. And he freely admits that he's not the first person to do this, but this is his go at it. It was a fun read, and you'll hear all about it in the interview, so wait for that. We also have a little segment where I'm going to talk about the Rule of 72. It's a quick and easy way to guesstimate how much your portfolio might grow in a few years. So I'll go over that during that little segment. And then the other thing I wanted to talk about is a thing called floating rate bonds. It's something that keeps coming up because people don't want to make 2 or 3% interest right now. It's been a recurring theme, and it's probably not going to go away in the near future, but really high quality short-term U.S. government bonds as measured by the Vanguard Bond Index Fund, short-term bond government fund, it has a yield of about 2.5%. Now, one thing I need to make sure that everyone understands is that the yield is what you will get if every single bond in that portfolio pays the full amount of their payments on time, every time, and they never miss. And that fund is likely to do so unless Trump completely fucks everything up, and then it's not going to matter where your money is anyway. But 2.5%, we're going to call it. That is your baseline. So 2.5% is what you're going to get without taking some risks. Now, if you go to corporate bonds, there's a slight chance of a little bit more default, but it's not that bad. And again, they're short-term bonds. Your yield is going to go to 2.6. 2.5 versus 2.6, not a big difference, obviously. And the problem is that if you go to long-term government bonds from the U.S., you don't even get to 3%. And that's called a flat yield curve, where 3 and 5 year bonds and 10-year bonds and 20-year bonds and 30-year bonds are all paying very similar yields. It is something that I don't like the situation. I currently don't invest in any intermediate or long-term bonds because that extra 0.5%, you're going from 2.5% on short-term to 3% on long-term, is not worth the risk that and the losses that you could suffer if interest rates go up, which we all expect them to do so. So we're kind of hiding down in a really safe 2.5%, 3% range with short-term government and short-term bonds. And you can add a little flavor to that with a splash of emerging market bonds, which I'll probably talk about more in a future episode, and high yield or junk bonds. Well, it's come up quite a bit recently. People have been asking me about a thing called floating rate bonds. And so when interest rates are really low and people don't want to make 2.5% to 3% or 3.5%, they want to make more. High interest rate bond funds become sellable by advisors. So they will suggest you should get a floating rate bond fund. And the dividends are much higher, and they're usually short-term bonds, and they do respond to interest rate fluctuations differently. So let me back up a step, I guess. A floating rate bond is a bond issued to a company that can't qualify for a conventional fixed rate loan. So if your business is not doing the best but needs some money and you can't get a 3 or 4% loan, you could pay a much higher rate, a 6 or 7% loan, and that would go into a junk bond category, or you get a floating rate loan, which it becomes a floating rate bond, where you pay maybe 3 or 4% today, but if interest rates go up, you have to pay 4 or 5% in the future. It's kind of like a variable home loan where you pay more when interest rates go up. And so these funds can pay considerably more. They can pay 5, 6, 7%. The higher the yield goes, generally that means the riskier the underlying bonds or the loans that are given out to these companies. So the higher the yield, so if you're getting 7 or 8% as promised to you as the yield, that means more of those bonds are going to default. So the yield of 8% is if every company pays every loan payment on time and none of them default. If a majority of them pay 8% and maybe 10% default, you're not going to get 8, you're going to get 7. If some of those default and their bonds get marked down to next to 0 because the company went bankrupt, you might not even make a net of 0 in this fund. You might actually get some dividends from the other bonds that are paying, but the fund itself goes down in value because the bonds keep defaulting. If you get to a point in time where the economy gets soft, you might still make 5 or 6% yield on this fund, but the value of the fund may go down 5 or 10%. So the net effect is nothing or a negative. And so you can create a problem if you're not careful, if you don't understand how this works, where you are getting 5 or 6% out every year, but year after year after year, your investment shrinks. So you're getting fed out this money and you feel great. And then 5 or 10 years later, you look at what was a $100,000 investment is now a $52,000 investment. It can be a serious problem if you don't know exactly what you're getting. So when times are good and there's a risk of rising interest rates, these things can pay nice dividends. But if the economy gets soft, if interest rates go up, these things can be a serious problem. So it's not necessarily bad per se to have in your portfolio, but again, it's one of these things that I would limit it to an absolute maximum of 5% of your portfolio. If you're close to or in retirement and you have a good chunk of your money in the cushion, this could be one of the pieces. But again, no more than 5% of your total portfolio and definitely not more than 10% of your total bonds. So just something to keep in mind how they work. It is kind of risky like junk bonds, but it has an advantage where it's not sensitive to interest rate increases, because when interest rates increase, these bonds will adjust and the people who borrowed the money have to pay more interest. So they don't go down when interest rates go up, they can go up. And you can actually make more money, assuming all the companies that borrowed the money don't go bankrupt or fail to make the payments. So that's kind of how that works. And let's see, what did I say? We've got Rule of 72, an interview coming up, so don't go anywhere. Now we're going to talk briefly about a thing called the Rule of 72. This is a quick little shortcut that you can use to kind of figure out how much your portfolio might be worth someday in the future. So let's say you have $100,000. If you are invested in the stock market, and if the stock market makes the average of a 10% return per year, you would double your portfolio in approximately 7.2 years. Clearly, 10 times 7.2 is 72. If you were to make 7.2% per year, your portfolio would double in about 10 years. If you make 2% a year, it'll take 36 years. So you get the idea. Clearly, it breaks down at the extremes, because if you make 72% in 1 year, your portfolio did not double. It went up 72%. So it's a really quick and easy kind of shortcut way to look at how market returns could perform. So if you made 10% a year, let's say you're 30 and you're fortunate enough to have $100,000. If you make slightly over 10% a year, your money could double in 7 years. So your 100,000 at 30 could become 200,000 at 37. It could become 400,000 at 44. It could become 800,000 at 51, and it could become 1.6 million at 58 and 3.2 million at 65. So you can see the power of compounding as these numbers double. Always keep in mind, of course, that there is also inflation. So even if you do somehow miraculously get to $3.2 million, it's not worth $3.2 million like today, because inflation goes up at 3% a year. So every 26 years, your money is worth half as much, because 24. So every 24 years. So 3 times 24 for the inflation, your money would be worth half as much. So if you're saving for 48 years, your money would be approximately worth 1/4 of its value. So if you went from 100,000 to 4 million or 6 million, it may sound great, but the 6 million in the future may only be worth 1.5 million in the future. So that is a quick and easy way. Again, 10% is the long-term return of the stock market. I don't like to use that so much to guesstimate future returns. I usually want to go with something a little more conservative, like 8%. And so if you make 8% per year, it will double in 9 years. I'm not saying that you're only going to make 8, but when I try to calculate for myself and for my clients, I use all kinds of very small, subtle tricks that are stacked up to make the portfolio look like it's going to be less way in the future. Because if you end up making mistakes or tweaking and making the portfolio look like a whole lot more in the future, you could end up with comically large amounts of money. You know, something says you're going to have $60 million when you retire. Odds are something's going to come along and that's not going to happen. So you want to be careful with these estimates. It's a fun game to play, and it can give you an idea that you're not saving enough, or how much, if you can't save ever again, how much your portfolio might grow to. I usually like to use 8% a year. If you make 10, you made more than you expected. If you make 6, you, of course, make a lot less than you expected. But hopefully it's something closer to 10. So 8 is a nice number, and if you end up with more, you're not sad. So that is a little bit on the rule of 72. I hate to do it, but I'm going to jump in here for a second and let you know that the upcoming interview did have some audio problems. Some of you will hear them. Maybe some of you won't. You'll be lucky. I tried to do what I could to clean it up, but the Skype connection would occasionally jump in volume and drop in volume. So I tried to balance that out best I could, but I'm kind of running out of time on my busy schedule, so I don't have all the time in the world to make it perfect. Like I said, some of you will notice it and it'll be kind of annoying, so my apologies in advance, but I think it worked out pretty well, so I didn't want to do it over, and I didn't want to burden the guest by doing the whole thing from scratch. But I think you'll survive and you'll enjoy it. So that's all I have to say about that.
There are people who believe that dinosaurs and men lived together, that they roamed the earth at the same time. There are museums that children go to in which they build dioramas to show them this. And what this is, purely and simply, is a clinical psychotic reaction. They are crazy. They are stone cold fuck nuts. I can't be kind about this, because these people are watching the Flintstones as if it were a documentary. Now, there is a big difference between the Old Testament and the New Testament, and that is the New Testament God is really kind of a great guy. He is, especially when you compare him to the Old Testament God, who is a prick. I don't know what happened to God, over time, how he matured, if he went to an anger management class, or maybe just the birth of a son calmed him down. But before he had the kid, holy fuck, he was out of control.
All right, everybody, welcome back. This is Phil Ferguson, and you are listening to The Phil Ferguson Show. We're going to have some extra special fun with our interview today. It's about a book called All That's Wrong with the Bible, Contradictions, Absurdities, and More. And the author is Jonah David Conner. Jonah, how are you today?
I'm good, thanks.
I just finished reading this book over the weekend. Great fun. Maybe you can tell us a little about your inspiration, dare I call it?
Yeah, well, my inspiration pretty much was lifelong. I was, as I said in the introduction to the book, was a lifelong, obviously, a Christian. I was bathed in Christianity, as I say. Fundamentalist from the cradle, essentially. I never knew anything outside of Christianity, as I'm sure a lot of Americans can relate to. You're raised in a conservative. I wasn't raised in the Bible Belt, but it might as well have been the Bible Belt.
Right.
So my parents were both believers, both conservative Protestants. I was raised as an independent Baptist. I had to be independent. I grew up going to a relatively small church in a relatively small town in the Midwest. We were there pretty much 2-3 times every week. I also, in addition to that, I went to private Christian school my whole life. I was never in a public school, not even kindergarten through graduating through high school, then on into college. I was always in a Christian environment, so I feel like that was something I had an authority to talk about. So I think that people, when they're reading a book like this, they want it to come from someone who's lived it, who's been in that worldview and had that worldview, and that's certainly the case for me. And I felt like I had something to add to the conversation, and that was initially the motivation for writing something about the Bible. I obviously have done a lot of research off and on throughout my life, but as I got older and into my late 20s, I started looking at the details of textual issues in the Bible that I'd never looked at before. So when you're raised, going to a Christian school, and you just assume these things are true. You take them, and your parents teach you this. Your teachers, also teach the same thing. They're in agreement, and you don't think there's anything wrong with it. You never imagine the idea that could possibly be another worldview or something that would contradict what your parents tell you, right?
Right.
So I started doing a lot of side study, so to speak. I just read stuff on my own. I started looking into these issues, and I started studying languages. That was one of my specialties. In college, I studied linguistics, so that was kind of what attracted me to the textual issues of the Bible, because I studied a lot of classical Greek. So that worked out well, that the New Testament was written in classical Greek, so I had a lot of background in that. And the issues just started popping out. I started spending time reading the original languages, looking at the manuscripts that we have, seeing these problems that are not on the surface. And that's the issue. And that's part of the reason why I think that Christianity in America especially just continues to thrive, because these issues aren't on the surface. You read the Bible, it all sounds good from the top. You read, something Jesus said, and love your neighbors, et cetera. But you don't see the underlying problems unless you really dig deep. And most people either don't have the time or they don't have the desire to do that. And it was something that I certainly did have. And I, after spending, several years looking at these issues, and it just all started to add up, and slowly, little by little, over a period of a few years, I started to lose the faith and realize, this can't be right. Like, the stuff they taught me can't be true.
Well, we're going to get
hard evidence that isn't.
We got lots of time to get into all that fun, of course. Let me back up a little step. You said Baptist. Was it kind of a non-denominational Baptist-y kind of thing?
Yeah, it's hard to classify. I mean, they call themselves independent Baptists. So it was just a small town in Illinois where I grew up, was the state of Illinois, and they didn't want to be part of a larger denomination.
Sure. Now, I don't know if you knew it, but I live in Illinois now, by Chicago, but for many years was by Champaign. So were you in central or southern Illinois? You said small town?
I grew up in Peoria.
I lived in Peoria for about 5 years.
That's where I grew up, and so I went to Peoria Christian High School. Actually, it was where I went to high school, and then K through 12 I went there. So it was a little school back in the 80s. It's grown a little bit, and they've got different campuses now. But yeah, it was all there in one building. So K through 12 in one building, and I was there the whole time.
So have you ever had anyone tell you that you must have never been a true Christian?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And that's, most people, the people that would say that to me were the people that didn't know me.
Right.
The people that I'm close to, like my friends, my family, they've never said that, and they never would have said that. Because I knew that I was passionate about what I thought was the truth. I was passionate about Christianity. I wanted to tell people. I did, in fact, tell people. I went on missionary trips. I went, later to Bible school, to Liberty University. So I was passionate about it, and was certainly believed it. I certainly thought that it was based on some evidence, at least.
Yeah. So all the way through high school, and then you went to at least at Liberty. Did you start at Liberty or finish at Liberty, or was that in the middle of some kind of?
I went through a couple semesters at a junior college, just taking some general education classes. But then I transferred to Word of Life Bible Institute. It's not a very big school, but it's kind of it's just a really fundamentalist small college up in upstate New York. Beautiful area, fantastic area. But I was there for a year. I finished, a year of classes there, and I transferred those classes to Liberty University. So I got credits for, some of the Bible classes I took there. And so I finished my BA at Liberty. So I graduated from Liberty.
So we're talking about from birth all the way to, 2021 at least, maybe 22, you were convinced and you were trying everything you could to learn about it. And did you think you were going to be a minister maybe?
Yes. Actually, when I was in high school, being in a Christian school, we would have from time to time, we would have people come and, Bible colleges or missionary organizations would come and give presentations and try to recruit people.
Yeah.
So I actually went to a weekend trip with New Tribes Mission organization. It's an organization that is kind of like Wycliffe Bible Translators, where they specialize in sending missionaries to unreached people groups, so Amazonian tribes or tribes in Papua New Guinea or something like that don't have the Bible in their native language. So as I said, I was always interested in languages, so I was interested possibly being a translator of that sort. Kind of like Dan Everett. I don't know if you know who Dan Everett is.
I know him very, very well, at least from his book. I've tried to get him on the show, and it hasn't worked out yet, but fascinating.
Okay. Oh, yeah, he also worked at Normal.
He did, which is an extra special perk for me because he's, nearby. But so, and you mentioned languages, and do I recall several languages that you're at least competent in?
Yeah, as far as speaking, like modern languages, I'm fluent in Spanish. I worked as a Spanish translator for a while. I taught Spanish at the University of Wisconsin for a couple of years as a lecturer. So that's the only language I would consider myself fluent as far as speaking. I've studied all the Romance languages pretty much. I took classes in Portuguese and a little bit of Italian and whatnot. But my secondary emphasis in college was Greek. So my PhD minor was in Greek. I wrote my master's thesis on New Testament translation, interestingly, from Greek, focusing on translating into Spanish, but also in translating it in other modern languages, just dealing with the issues that arise when you're trying to translate an ancient language. So, yeah, as far as academics, that's ever since Liberty, it was all linguistics. So after Liberty, I didn't study anything with the Bible as far as formally at an institution. Sure.
I understand, and my listeners know, and they're probably even annoyed by it. I'm conversational in Italian, and we could probably have fun with that, but that's for a different time. But so you did all this stuff.
I'm a little rusty in my Italian, right? Yeah.
Eccellente, signore. You graduate from Liberty University. You do a little more studying in linguistics. What happened next? How do you get to the point from being this would-be evangelical minister to writing this book? What happened? Did you hit your head or something?
That's what a lot of people would love it if that was true. I can tell you that. that's one thing that, it's saddening, honestly, when I talk to a lot of people, and even people that were, like aunts and uncles and whatnot, that should have known better. But the first thing they do when you tell someone about this, you tell them, you kind of pour out your soul, for example, the things you're dealing with, you give them all this evidence, and then the first thing they say is, what happened to you?
Yeah. Who hurt you?
Did you hit your head? Or did you get beat up after school? But yeah, it's pretty frustrating, but it's all part of, it's to be expected, I guess. You're making huge life changes, so people inevitably equate, a huge life change with something drastic that caused that huge life change. So in a sense there was. I mean, it was, to me, I've always considered myself an academic. I've always been in the academic world. So the catalyst, reading as much as I could and just learning things about science that I didn't learn in my conservative Christian high school. They were conveniently left out of my biology class. But things like that, just over time, it just accumulated. Anyone who's deconverted knows that it's not overnight. It's certainly not something that happens, over the weekend. It's a slow process. It's something that you accumulate, little by little. One thing adds to the next, and it just becomes, in the end, it becomes too much, and you just say, okay, I can't believe this anymore. It can't be true. And it's the same thing with other people that have written about this, and like Seth Andrews and Matt Dillahunty. All those guys they were believers too, and they could attest to all that I'm saying. That Dan Barker also talks a lot about, that it's a process. It's slow. It wasn't overnight, and it's part of a continuum. So you see people, for example, that they're a hardcore fundamentalist to the right, and then you see people that are hardcore atheists to the left, and most people are in the middle. And people are moving. They're not static. So to me, it was just the study of the hard evidence is what changed me. It was the hard evidence that I had not seen as a youth. There's only so much you can learn and know when you're 15.
Right.
It's mostly passion when you're 15. It's not based on hard evidence because you haven't accumulated it yet. You don't have time to study that. You haven't been in grad school. So it was the accumulation of hard evidence. Like I said in the book, it was in my late 20s when I really started to turn. So this is after I left Liberty. Obviously, I was a believer when I graduated from Liberty. So it was after I was an adult, for sure. I started really looking at the evidence. I really started looking at the biblical text, and I said, I'm not going to give the Bible a free pass. I'm not going to, nothing's above refutation. Nothing is above skepticism. Nothing is above, looking at the details. So, I said, let's look at the Bible like any other book, and let's say, what does this passage teach? Okay, this passage seems to make it sound like it's okay to have slaves, things like that didn't really jump out to me before. Like I had read those verses before, but you just kind of gloss over them when you're in that bubble. It all makes sense when you're in the bubble. When you're surrounded by people that are reaffirming these beliefs, and you're in an isolated place, like I was in a lot of these, the Bible school and other mission places I went to. No one disagrees. Everyone says the Bible is the Word of God. Everyone says it's infallible. So you just tend to not question it. So it's only when you're removed from that. When I was removed from those bubbles, I forced myself to start questioning, and I forced myself to look at the details, to start studying the Greek manuscripts, which was huge. That was a huge turning point in my life. I started studying Greek manuscripts. I can read these now.
I think one of the problems you have here is maybe you took this all too seriously. Because
I shouldn't have been looking for evidence for my beliefs. Right?
Yeah. Well, I've had so many people that I've interviewed that I end up in a position where they've lost their faith. They either want to defend it against people who are being mean and arguing against it, or they want to learn more about it, or they have this philosophy that if this is the most important message ever given to human beings, it obviously must stand up to criticism. So let me dig in, get to the facts, go to the original sources, and it will only reinforce my beliefs. Is that kind of the thought process you had?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, because, so I first started questioning when I left the bubble, when I was out of Liberty, I started rubbing shoulders of, the first time people that didn't believe. And I was like, these people, they don't seem like bad people. They're normal people,
right?
But yet they're not Christian. How is that, right? So you grow up, and it's like you have this view of outsiders as if everyone who doesn't believe in Christianity is morally, empty. That they live hopeless lives, trudging through day by day, just wishing they had a God to fill them up. It was that kind of a mentality that how do people live without Christianity, right? How do you make it through the day and not just kill yourself? So it was starting rubbing shoulders with those people and realizing, hey, they're normal people. Some are good, some are bad, just like religious people. And that kind of, pushed me to investigate more. So I started thinking, how do I defend my faith to these people? How do I go to, University of Wisconsin, for goodness sake, with 40,000 people, and what do I have to offer them, right? And how do I say Christianity is better than Hinduism? Christianity is better than, whatever, Buddhism, whatever these people believe, or it's better than secularism, it's better than, non-belief. How do I defend that? So that was one of the reasons I started, looking at these details. So how can I defend this, right? And then the deeper I got, the more I realized, gosh, I don't have a whole lot to offer. This actually is pretty shaky. When you look at the textual evidence, you look at the Greek, you look at the manuscripts, and you look at the details of the Gospels, even the heart of Christianity, the core of it. I'm not talking about the fringe passages. I'm talking about the heart and the core of Christianity, which is the Gospels. There are some serious contradictions there. There are some serious problems, both historically and theologically, and it's something I never even would have thought possible.
Well, I want to get into some of those, but before I do, I'm gonna, if you don't mind, read a sentence here that I really liked and highlighted as I was going through on Kindle. And so this is a quote from your book, so forgive me for doing this to you, but it says,
no problem.
Yet even if I am misled and plausible explanations exist for all of these contradictions, they at least prove that the scripture is not written as well as it could be. And that's one of the things that always struck me when I would see people constantly, ministers, evangelical apologists, they're saying, oh, well, what it says there is not what it really means. If you go back to the ancient Greek or the Latin or the Aramaic or whatever language that section was originally written in and look at the original back from 2,000 years ago, you'll see what it really means is this. And I keep thinking to myself, if I need this dude to know 4 languages to translate this for me, what value is this book? I mean, if I just read it straight, I don't get the right message. So walk me through the thought process there, where it's not even clear it could be better written. So how can it be the ultimate book?
Yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, if you think about it too, the ancient. This is the thing that shocked me too when I started looking at these linguistic and manuscript issues was, if you're trying to reveal yourself to all of humanity, right? First of all, why do you wait until 500 BC? Right? There are civilizations that have come and gone by then, right?
Yeah.
So they're just out, right? They don't get any revelation. So you wait until 500 BC to do anything, right? And then you reveal yourself in a language that's spoken by about maybe 1 million people, maybe, probably much less, right? You don't reveal anything to the people in America that they're already building temples over here, right? You leave them all out of it. And then, even for Jewish people today, I mean, the language has changed. The language that the Bible was written in has changed drastically. People that speak modern Hebrew, they don't. It's not the same as the language that was written in the Bible. The same thing with Greek. People speak modern Greek. That's not what the New Testament was written in. So even Jewish people today would have to study to learn how to read Bible in Hebrew. So like all these hurdles that come to a supposed revelation to all of mankind, it's just nonsense. When you look at it like that, that's a terrible method for getting your message out. If you really want people to know you exist, if you really want people to know that you went through all this trouble to create them and die for them and save them from their sins, that's an epic fail, in my opinion. So yeah, there's just the things like this. Like I said, you don't see it when you're in the bubble. It makes sense to you then, but you take a step back and you're like, holy cow, that's crazy.
Well, if you don't mind,
you only reveal yourself in Hebrew.
Sure. I mean, there's so many examples in this book, and listeners, you need to get a copy of this. I love the way it's laid out, and you can kind of flip through it, and you can pick and choose the pieces you want, and you've got the citations, and you've got chapter and verse literally listed out. And I'm going to just grab a few of these, and of course, if you have a favorite, just let me know what it is, and we'll talk about that. But there's no way we can cover all of them. But one of the fun ones I always thought about, and you talked about it, is there's 2 different genealogies and 2 different fathers for Joseph, as in Joseph and Mary.
Right.
Walk me through some of that if you can do that.
Right. Well, the genealogy of Jesus is mentioned in only 2 of the 4 Gospels. So Matthew and Luke mention it. And they both say that this is the genealogy of Jesus, and they both go through Joseph, right? Which is in itself, and I point out, in itself is absurd, because they both say that Joseph is not actually Jesus' father.
Right.
So it's like, what's the point of this, right? Anyway, so they list them, and name after name after this guy begat this guy and all this, right? But they're both completely different. They're one of them's, I think, 15, 16 generations longer. So what do the Christians do with this? Obviously, they recognize that too. They noticed it. So the traditional explanation is that one of the genealogies is Mary's genealogy. The other genealogy is Joseph's. Right? That's still problematic for several reasons. The main one, being they both say they're Joseph's genealogies. Both of the writers saying this is through Joseph. Right? So if one's through Mary, then why is he saying it's through Joseph? So that's one problem. The second problem is the generational difference, right? You have, like I said, at least, I don't remember the exact number, but several generations different as far as numbers. So assuming that Mary and Joseph were at least somewhat similar age, there shouldn't be that many different, generations. So that's just an example of how you almost wonder why did the biblical writer even put this in here? What's the point? If you're not going to do it well, why do it at all?
Right.
So it's issues like that where that just goes back to what you said earlier. It's like the Bible could have been written so much better. It could have given an accurate genealogy. Why didn't it? So it just shows again. It points to human authorship from start to finish. It doesn't. There's no divine aspect that stands out to you when you look at it critically. And that's one of many examples. As far as the contradictions, though, I think what I focused on, and I have a whole section in the book on contradictions specifically related to the life of Jesus.
Yeah.
So that's the heart, obviously. And I've talked to Christians a lot, even my own. I have 2 brothers that are believers, 2 brothers who are Christians, and my parents are still Christians. So I talk to them a lot, and then I'll point these out. I'll point out the fact that the Bible condones polygamy, the Bible condones child sacrifice, and they'll say, "Oh no," whatever. And then when you show it to them, like, "Okay, yeah, but that's still the Old Testament, right? That's their response. That's the Old Testament." So then, they kind of brush off aside half of the supposed revelation to mankind. But then you can't brush aside the Gospels. You can't brush aside Jesus.
So give us some Jesus contradictions, or problems or funny things. What sticks out in your mind?
Well, for me, if I could, skim out everything and go straight to the core of what convinced me.
Yeah.
The core of what convinced me to leave Christianity were the contradictions regarding the resurrection of Jesus, because the resurrection of Jesus is the absolute core of Christianity. And Paul wrote 1 Corinthians, said the same thing. He said, the resurrection of Jesus is our belief. If there's no resurrection of Jesus, then Christianity is phony. Christianity, we're wasting our time. Essentially, what Paul says in 1 Corinthians, and I agree with him. So I started studying the contradictions of the resurrection. And this is something that Bart Ehrman has emphasized in many of his speeches. He encourages people to take the 4 Gospels. Right? Anyone can do this. It's not like you have to be a specialist. You take the 4 Gospels, you put them in a parallel account. So you take, Matthew's version of the resurrection. So all 4 Gospels talk about the resurrection. That's one thing that all 4 mention. So read Matthew's account, read Mark's account, read Luke's account, read John's account, and read them in the same sitting. And you're just astounded by the differences. And these are not small, and these are not omissions. So people will say, wow, he just left out detail. No, these are contradictory details. You cannot be, one man outside the tomb and 2 angels inside the tomb. You can't be that at the same time. So these are issues like that with the resurrection. And you have let's see the exact. Well, I've got for Jesus, I've got things that don't deal just with the resurrection, but the ones with the resurrection were the ones that most.
Yeah, I mean, there's the story of, like,
as a believer, right?
For example, who came to the tomb, right? All 4 Gospels have a different account of who was there at the tomb. And didn't one of them, there was a man or an angel inside the tomb?
Yeah, let me find this exactly. I'm trying to flip through a book here while I'm on the phone.
No, it's all good.
Yeah, it's one... So let's see. I have them numbered. I hope that helps the reader. I have them numbered. So you've got, so for each contradiction, I ask a question first. So I have a number, and I'll say, for example, who went to Jesus' tomb after his death? That's one question. Then I have the contradiction there. Then I say, when did Mary Magdalene or other women go? So when did they go? Who went? Was the rock rolled away when Mary arrived? Who was at the tomb when they arrived? Where were they, when they arrived? What did they say to Mary or Magdalene or others? What happened when they left? Where did the disciples go after the resurrection? Some of them say that they went to Galilee. Well, modern readers aren't familiar with that, but Galilee is not Jerusalem. Okay? Jerusalem was not in Galilee. Galilee was a northern region by the Sea of Galilee, obviously. But it was not Jerusalem. It's not the same thing. Jerusalem is not Galilee. Galilee was a region. Jerusalem, obviously, is the city. But you can't be in Galilee and Jerusalem at the same time. That's pretty simple to understand that. So things like that. I couldn't believe it when I studied that. I was like, I can't believe I didn't notice these before, right? And it's because I think people just don't do that kind of study. They read the Bible, but they'll say, let's read the Gospel of Matthew, right? And then 6 months later, you read the Gospel of Luke. Well, you're not going to notice these details if you're not doing a comparative study at the same time, and you don't even need to know Greek to do that. But certainly when you do know Greek, it stands out even more, and there are even more issues that come up. But even not knowing Greek at all, even just reading in the translation, you notice there are some serious problems here.
Now, could these problems come in during the translations? I mean, I'm assuming, and yes, listeners, I'm baiting you with this question. Didn't you go back to the original ones that were written in like the year 10?
Do you want me personally?
Yeah.
No. Well, that's the thing. We don't have any, Phil. We don't have any original manuscripts. There are none. They don't exist. And that's one thing that the general public doesn't know either. When someone produces a translation, okay, let's say you're going to do the King James, you're going to do the New American Standard, the NIV, whatever. You've got 100 of them now. So when they produce those translations, it's a committee who sits around. They take all the available manuscripts and they compare and contrast them, and then they put, the reading that they prefer in their translation. And sometimes they'll, if there's an alternative reading that's of significance, they'll put it in a footnote or something like that. But, there is no original text singular. It's original texts, plural, and they're not even really original. They're copies. So
right. They're the oldest copies we have, I guess.
Exactly, yeah. So one thing that was also astounding to me when I started looking into this issue was the earliest gospel we have, the earliest complete Greek manuscript we have is from 200 AD, very conservatively dated. So it's probably later than that, but let's be conservative and say that it's 200 AD. Well, that's over a century, a solid century of copying by hand, passing it around throughout the Mediterranean. So you copy a text in Alexandria, you put that text, send that text to Jerusalem, whatnot. So these are being copied by hand. Obviously, they're for the most part they're capable people copying it, but it doesn't matter if you're capable or not. You're hand copying something. You're going to make mistakes. You're going to let your own interpretations weigh into how you copy it. And we know for a fact, and Bart Ehrman has always emphasized this, we know for a fact that scribes did in fact modify the text. We know that. It's indisputable. And we have very hard evidence to back that claim. And that was something that I never would have dreamed of. I never would have dreamed that was true. How could you can't change the Bible? Who's going to do that, right?
You mean they didn't tell you that in Liberty University?
They conveniently forgot to mention that in my biblical studies. But that's the thing. I mean, the people that teach these classes, they're aware of these textual issues, but they certainly don't talk about them. They don't advertise them. So yeah, it's sad that there's so much secrecy, and it's sad that there's so much ignorance, because the common believer in the church that's paying their tithes to the pastor, and they're not aware of these things. They're not aware of these issues, and it's not their fault necessarily. They're being fed, something that's simply not true. The pastors and teachers are presenting the Bible as if it's one thing, and it's really not. I mean, it's only after, concentrated study of the evidence that some of these come out, and it sometimes it takes, sometimes you have to be an expert to know some of these, But as I said, with the resurrection issues, you don't have to be an expert to recognize that. You don't have to be an expert to see that, okay, there's something wrong here. This is not reliable testimony. And it's even more evident, of course, when you do study the Greek and Hebrew, but you don't need to realize that these are there.
Right. Another section, and I think it's a very important part of the concept of Christianity, how does one get salvation? Is it predestined? Is it through faith alone? Is it through works? Any comments on that?
Yeah. Well, for the Independent Baptists of Central Illinois,
yeah,
it was faith alone, grace alone. But that's the thing too that kills me now when I look back. It's like Christianity itself really should be Christianities plural. I mean, there are so many different denominations that believe very different things. They're not unified. They don't even view each other as true believers. I mean, when I grew up, we thought all Catholics were going to hell. I mean, honestly, we thought that Catholics were not Christians, all of them. So that's how many million people in the world they're all going to hell. So they're not in agreement about even the basic tenets of their faith. So that, as you mentioned, you mentioned salvation. It depends on what Christian you ask, right? So some Christians would say, well, it's grace alone, faith alone. It doesn't matter what you do. You could be Hitler. If Hitler converted the day before he died, then he's going to heaven. And then you can have someone who lived a great life and who fed the sick and all that, or treated the sick and fed the hungry. And if they didn't say the right, if they didn't believe the right theological tenets, then they're going to hell. So that's one part of Christianity. The other part of Christianity will say, well, it's a combination. You have to have some works, to show evidence of true belief. But it's the faith that saves you, but you also have to have works. Other Christians would say, well, it's mostly, you have to do things. You have to say this certain prayer. You have to, whatever. So it's a big debate for these things that you would think that they would be in agreement on, right? You'd think that they would say, oh, we got this one down. We know how to be saved. But no, it's not. There's a big, there's certainly debate amongst Christians. There's certainly disagreement, and it's surprising, honestly, that even the basic tenets of their faith would be so debated.
Yeah.
I think that they would at least be in agreement on that, right?
Well, it's fast.
Things like,
go ahead.
No, I was saying like things, related to salvation, but not necessarily. So, for example, praying. Who do we pray to? Do we have to confess to a priest, or do we not? Does Mary intercede for us? Is there a purgatory, for goodness sake? That's a pretty big deal, right? That's a pretty big deal. If there's a purgatory, I kind of want to know. If there's not, I kind of want to know. So it's interesting that even these really fundamental beliefs are not clearly taught. They're disagreed on, even among believers. So that's something that surprised me when I started looking into this.
Well, it is something I find fascinating that, at least in the United States, Christians can kind of come together and all say, we're all Christians, we're all on the same side, we're 75% of the population, and we get to dictate what goes on. And if you take out other religions, you'll find believers quickly come to arguments over, like you said, every little detail. How am I saved? Is there a purgatory? When am I supposed to be baptized? Do I have to understand it, or can it be done right after I'm born? Just a thing after thing that are incredibly important. I mean, I've even talked to people who describe themselves as Christian that said they didn't accept the divinity of Jesus. And I was like, now, wait a minute. How does that work? And of course,
go
ahead.
No, I was just saying, I think that's another way that Christianity is modernizing, and they realize that they're under attack, at least, mentally under attack. Obviously, we're not throwing them to the lions, but you know what I'm saying? We're definitely questioning their teachings. And that's something that didn't happen for centuries. People didn't question these teachings, and now we are, and it's okay to do that. And you can publish a book like mine, and people aren't trying to kill me, so that's progress.
Yeah. Well,
so, that's good. But at the same time, they realize that, and there's going to be a knee-jerk reaction, and, so...
The book, of course, has a great big section on contradictions, and you mentioned a whole section that is your favorite. The heart of the matter is the contradictions about Jesus himself and salvation. And then, of course, we have what my fun stuff is, the whole section on absurdities. And one of my personal favorite stories, you talked about Lot. And, of course, he's the only guy that gets saved from Sodom and Gomorrah. He is the one and only righteous person. And, I mean, his wife and daughters come along incidentally because they're his property. But what does Lot do after he leaves Sodom and Gomorrah? Can you walk us through that story? Do you remember it?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So the whole story of Sodom and Gomorrah, I mean, as far as literature, it sure makes for good reading, So I strongly recommend people to read it. It's very entertaining. So what happens is, Yahweh, supposedly, let's go back to the beginning. So Yahweh comes down and he says, I'm going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah because they're wicked, right? So Abraham tries to intercede for him. He said, no, my nephew Lot lives there, and also, if I can find righteous people, would you not destroy it? He's like, okay, yeah, fine. So they have angels go down there. They meet Lot. Evidently, the men of the city come out. Every one, it says, every single man came out and tried to attack the angels, evidently wanting to have sex with them. So Lot says, no, I don't want you to do that, but here are my 2 virgin daughters. Feel free to do what you want with them, right? What every father would do, I'm sure.
Yeah, nice guy.
Yeah, something very, very, someone we all look up to. So they evidently don't want the daughters. They're interested only in the angels. So Yahweh says, okay, this city needs to be destroyed. They flee. Okay, so they said, get out. Take your daughters, take your wife. So Lot, his wife and his 2 daughters, flee the city. Yahweh sends fire and brimstone to demolish everything and kill all the people there. Well, the wife famously turns around for whatever reason, and she's turned into a pillar of salt. So the wife's out of the picture now. So it's just the father and the 2 daughters. They have nowhere to go, or at least immediately, so they go to a cave. Right? They're kind of camped out there, just trying to figure out what they're going to do now. And for some reason, the daughters evidently are worried about having children. So what are we going to do now? We don't have any kids, right? So they decide to get their father drunk so they can have sex with him and get impregnated. So evidently they both of them, subsequent nights, interestingly, which is astronomically improbable, but anyway, subsequent nights, they both get married after having sex with their own father in a cave. And those are their offspring supposedly become, Moab and Ammon, which are 2 ancient people groups that, interestingly, were hated by the Israelites, right? So this story written by the Israelites could have definitely had some revenge type of flavor when they're writing about the origin of their hated neighbors. But so the issue isn't necessarily that. That's obviously a very bizarre and very wacky story. So that's one problem. But the second problem is the fact that the New Testament claims that Lot was righteous, that he suffered, and that he was plagued by the wickedness in Sodom and Gomorrah, that he was a righteous man, and all this. So you get conflicting messages between the Old and New Testament quite frequently. So you'll read a section of the Old Testament, you'll come away with a reasonable interpretation, and the New Testament writers throw you for a loop and say something totally different. So in the specific example of Lot, the issue is that he's called a righteous man. I mean, that's crazy. So that's the issue with that specific example. But Yeah, there are many others that, I didn't really want to use the word absurdity. I tried to want,
Yeah.
I thought there could have been a better one, but I ended up keeping with that. But, I didn't want it to be too incendiary as far as the wording of it. But
Well, I like it.
I couldn't think of a better one at the end. I'm like, I'll just keep it. So
Now who was it that?
it's an absurd story. That's
There's just this laundry list of absurd stories. Who was it that killed like 1,000 people with the jawbone of an ox or an ass?
Oh, that was Samson. Yeah, jawbone of a donkey. So, evidently, Samson is this war hero, right? He's one of the judges of the Israelite people. In a time when they didn't have an established monarchy, so they had a series of judges, what they called them, that ruled the people in kind of tribal situation. Anyway, Samson was one of the heroes. He was one of the that liberated them from the Philistines, which were a people group that were always in conflict with Israel, right, fighting over territory or whatnot. Excuse me. So Samson kills 1,000 of them in one day with the jawbone of a donkey. The stories like that, they're, like I said, from a literary standpoint, they make for a good story, right? I mean, it's interesting, it's fun to read it. But the problem is they're trying to make this history, they're trying to make this history. So if you do the same thing with the Iliad and the Odyssey, there's a lot of great literature in the Iliad and the Odyssey. It's a classic. It's interesting to read. It's fun, all the adventures they have. But no one's trying to make that historical.
Right.
No one's trying to say that they actually, killed a Cyclops. No one's saying that. So the issue is that people are taking these stories, which are great stories, and look from a literary standpoint, and they're trying to make them history, and they're trying to make them factual, and that's where they run into a laundry list of problems. And when you look at it and you examine the data, any reasonable person is going to say this didn't happen. It didn't happen. It's a story. It's myth. It's a hero just like Odysseus or anyone else, that the ancient people had and revered and whatnot. And people like stories. People like talking about the origins of their cultures and where did we come from. And these are questions that everybody asks and they want to know. And talking about these people, how they got victory over their neighboring Philistines and the Moabites.
Right. Now, another thing that is great interest to me is there's this section, or at least a couple of different times, where it talks about women have to be silent in church, call their husband Lord, and women cannot teach.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's one thing that goes back to what I said a little earlier about how Christianity is always adapting. It's adapting to the culture. I think that's one of the reasons why Christianity has flourished. Religion is survival of the fittest in a sense. How many religions have come and gone? How many religions have fallen on the side, just like animal species? They're no longer there. But Christianity has survived, and one of the reasons why it has is because it adapts to culture very well. If you take a medieval monk from 1000 CE and you take him out of that monastery and you stick him into a megachurch in Colorado Springs, he's going to be so incredibly out of place. It's like it's a different religion, and that's one of the reasons why Christianity is surviving. So you have today where you have secular society saying, okay, we need to stop this overt discrimination of women. There's no reason why a woman can't teach. There's no reason why a woman can't be a leader, and there isn't. So people have realized this from secular changes, right? So they just say, okay, well, let's incorporate it into our religion, even though our holy book specifically mandates against that. It's incredible to me, how people can overlook these things, and somehow they can conclude that, the Bible all along intended for women to be pastors. Well, no, it didn't. It really didn't. Yeah, there were some women. Female figures of renown, even back in the Old Testament, like Deborah was a judge, was a female judge. There were other heroines of the Israeli people, but if you look at the New Testament, I don't think anyone can read the New Testament and conclude that women were supposed to be leaders of churches. That's not the conclusion that most people get. And you have overt passages like this actually mandating against that and saying, no, women should not be teachers for whatever reason. They didn't really give a whole lot of reasons, but that's what they say. So it's interesting to see how modern Christianity conveniently ignores these verses in their own Bible. So it's another good example of adaptation of modern Christianity.
Well, I spent 5 years pretending to be a Missouri Synod Lutheran as an adult, which is another long story I won't bore you with. But it would fascinate me that women could not be ministers in the Missouri Synod Lutheran Church, and several congregations wouldn't even allow women to vote on church business, but they would allow them to be teachers. And I was like, well, you're kind of contradicting your own little thing here within itself. But, they would just pick and choose. And one part, they want to keep women down. But in the other part, they're like, well, the women will volunteer to work for almost no pay to teach classes, so we'll let them.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. When I was growing up, it was pretty much the same way. Where I remember we had gone to, or I had gone personally with a friend or whatever. I'd gone to a church where a female was pastor, and it was someone who had just, they had just switched from a male to a female pastor. So it was this big, controversy. I remember going there and just thinking, wow, this is crazy. There's a woman pastor. I'd never even heard of such a thing, right? Growing up, I mean, it was totally impermissible, right? But yeah, it's something that it'll be interesting to see what happens, right? And if people continue to follow the example of other mainstream denominations, or if they stay, male only as far as the leadership. But yeah, it is certainly hypocritical, as you said, where women can teach classes that are only attended by women or something like that. They can teach classes with children, but they can't teach adult men. Right? Yeah. So it's nonsense, obviously, but it's mostly, I think those kind of issues are mostly, they end up being cultural. It's just what people are used to seeing, and I don't think if you interview someone, the average Christian on the street, you couldn't probably give a reason why a woman shouldn't be a pastor, but it's just not what he thinks is quote unquote the right thing to do. So it becomes cultural, a lot of these things, and just like anything else, but
Understood.
Yeah, so it'll be interesting to see what happens in the future.
Well, I'm getting to that point where I want to wrap up so we don't spend all day doing this, but I think we could probably go on for another hour. I just want to point out to the listeners, there's more sections that we haven't even covered. There's prophecies and a whole thing that I did not even know existed, repeated passages where entire phrases, sentences, a couple of lines in a row are repeated and the next page or two. You document scribal changes, specifically to the New Testament, all the different interpretations and variants, and we only scratch the surface on the contradictions in the Bible and the absurdities and all that stuff. Is there anything that, in particular, a favorite story or item that we haven't brought up yet?
Well, being someone who's studied linguistics, obviously I've really enjoyed writing and researching a section on textual variants and on the scribal changes to the New Testament. That's something that totally blew my mind when I first came across it. I can't believe this. I can't believe these exist. I can't believe that someone would, take out a phrase from the Bible. How could they do that, right? But it happened, and people added, whole verses and took them out and adjusted them. And that was just shocking to me when I was looking into this several years ago. And I highly recommend people to look into that issue. A lot of people they've never even heard of that kind of stuff. And that's why I really respect Bart Ehrman as someone who's brought that to the light. He's brought that to public knowledge that these issues exist and we need to stop hiding them. Christians don't want to talk about them, obviously, but they're there and we need to look at them. So, yeah, I definitely enjoyed writing those parts.
Well, I enjoyed reading all of it. Had a great fun. Can recommend it to the listeners. And again, it is the full title. I'm going to give it here for the listeners: All That's Wrong with the Bible, Contradictions, Absurdities, and More. And it's written by Jonah David Conner. So if you Google or look for those things, you can find the book in all good bookstores. Jonah, if someone has questions or wants to talk to you more about it, are you open for that? And if so, how do they reach you?
Absolutely. I put, I think it's still there. I had I created a separate email address for this because I didn't want to mix it up with work or whatnot, but JonahDavidConner@gmail.com is the email address I just put out for the public. Anyone who has questions about the book or comments or whatever, I'm more than welcome or more than willing to talk to them. I enjoy it. So
great. Well, Jonah, thank you.
It's my full name and then @gmail.com.
Excellent. Well, thank you for taking some time to talk to me and share your findings, wisdom, whatever, with the listeners. I greatly appreciate it, and thank you for being on the Phil Ferguson Show.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Nothing seems crazy when you're used to it. There's so much crazy shit everywhere. We're used to it. And everything seems crazy when you're not used to it. That's why so many comics make fun of Scientology, right? Because because it's a batshit crazy religion, but it's no more batshit crazy than every single religion. It's just new, Christianity is super old, but it's fucking crazy. I mean, you're born a sinner. By being born, you are a sinner and you're going to hell. But you can just apologize and then you can go to heaven. No big deal. If you're a murderer, same thing, it's just apologize and go to heaven. You can be Hitler and go to confession and say, "Forgive me, Father, I killed 6 million Jews." And the priest would just be like, "No problem, say 10 Hail Marys." And Hitler goes to heaven. Hitler goes to heaven is the name of my band. Scientology is weird because it's new. It feels weird in our ear holes to hear people worshiping a guy named Ron. We know Rons in our life. He had to change his name to L. Ron because there was another Ron Hubbard in the Writers Guild. That's how recent a religion it is. And people who follow their religion to the letter of the law are just silly. I mean, I want to tell Hasidic Jews, I promise you, God will not mind if you wear a nice cotton blend in the summer. You're being fucking ridiculous. But we live in the greatest country in the world. A country where we have freedom of religion and separation of church and state, only we don't at all and nobody says anything because we're used to it. It says in God we trust on our money. It says in God we trust above the judge's bench in a courtroom, in a court of law where you have to put your hand on a Bible, the Christian Bible. It's not my Bible. I mean, if I tell the truth, it's because I tell the truth, not because I put my hand on a book and made a wish. That's fucking crazy. That's craziness.
You're listening to The Phil Ferguson Show.
Well, hopefully you learned a little something about the Bible. Great fun book. That is why I nicknamed it The Atheist Maker. If you read that thing, seriously read it. In the joke I'll say, in its native English, it will confuse you and bore you and bring you to tears and make you want to slam your head into a wall. So I recommend it all the time, and I think it's a fantastic thing. The people that take it seriously a little scare me, but what are you going to do? Quick review here on iTunes from Eric P. Again, thank you for the 5-star review, Eric P. Anyone who listens to the show and you think you get some value out of it, giving me a review at iTunes, hopefully 5 stars, but, let your conscience be your guide, or at Stitcher. That's the only 2 places I'm aware of currently that you can leave reviews. It does help the show get shared. It does help people when they stumble across it to go, wow, this has now 194 reviews on iTunes. This is a real show thing. So they might actually listen to it. It helps me out, so I appreciate it very much. This is the review from Eric P. Great podcast. You don't have to enjoy both finance and straightforward rational viewpoints to love this show. But since I'm an accountant by trade and spent half a century under the spell of organized religion, this show is both refreshing and informative for me. Phil is down to earth and rational as you can get. End quote. Okay. I don't know about the rational as you can get, because I am a human, just like most of my listeners. I'm sure there's a few cats and dogs that are listening, and I appreciate your listenership too. But I make mistakes. I get emotional. I fuck things up. And I find on a regular basis that I make errors. I make errors on the show, and I believe things that aren't true. But I think one of the most valuable things that someone can do is to acknowledge their errors and try to fix their mistakes. We need more of that in politics. Anyway, I won't go on a total rant about that. Going to wrap up the show. Thank you so much for listening, and I do hope to see you out there somewhere at a conference. Until then, ciao.
I'm a married man, you know I can't hold hands. Front hug all day long with no other demands. But I ask for all of you until you say I do. No front hugging or PDA or your EG time is through. But some of y'all are slick, try to pull this trick. Your hug starts from the side, but soon it turns legit. So if you end up here, then go ahead and scream it. When I hug people, I leave room for the Holy Spirit. If a girl walks up with her arms spread wide, and she's front hug down without looking her eye, you better turn to the side, pat her on the back. Jesus never hugged. Everybody like that, screaming.